the disorder and the darkness described in the second sentence of the Bible, and God brings out of it order and beauty and goodness. He makes a world where life can flourish. And God makes these creatures called humans, or Adam in Hebrew. He makes them in his image, which has to do with their role and purpose in God's world. So the humans are made to be reflections of God's character out into the world, and they're appointed as God's representatives to rule his world on his behalf, which in context means to harness all of its potential, to care for it, and make it a place where even more life can flourish. God blesses the humans. It's a key word in this book. And he gives them a garden. It's like a place from which they begin starting to build this new world. Now, the key is that the humans have a choice about how they're going to go about building this world. And that's represented by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Up till now, God has provided and defined what is good and what is not good. But now God is giving the humans the dignity and the freedom of a choice. Are they going to trust God's definition of good and evil, or are they going to seize autonomy and define good and evil for themselves? And the stakes are really high. To rebel against God is to embrace death, because you're turning away from the giver of life himself. This is represented by the tree of life. And so in chapter 3, a mysterious figure, a snake, enters into the story. The snake's given no introduction other than it's a creature that God made. And it becomes clear that it's a creature in rebellion against God, and it wants to lead the humans into rebellion and their death. The snake tells a different story about the tree and the choice. It says that seizing the knowledge of good and evil are not going to bring death, that it's actually the way to life and becoming like God themselves. Now, the irony of this is tragic because we know the humans, they're already like God. They were made to reflect God's image. But instead of trusting God, the humans seize autonomy, they take the knowledge of good and evil for themselves, and in an instant, the whole story spirals out of control. The first casualty is human relationships. The man and the woman, they suddenly realize how vulnerable they are. Now, they can't even trust each other. And so they make clothes and they hide their bodies from one another. The second casualty is that intimacy between God and the humans is lost. So they go and run and hide from God, and then when God finds them, they start this game of blame shifting about who rebelled first. Now right here, the story stops, and there's a series of short poems where God declares to the snake and then to the humans the tragic consequences of their actions. God first tells the snake that despite its apparent victory, it is destined for defeat, to eat dust. God promises that one day a seed or a descendant will come from the woman who's going to deliver a lethal strike to the snake's head, which sounds like great news, but this victory is going to come with a cost because the snake too will deliver a lethal strike to the descendant's heel as it's being crushed. It's a very mysterious promise of this wounded victor. But in the flow of the story so far, you see this is an act of God's grace. The humans, they've just rebelled, and what does God do? He promises to rescue them. But this doesn't erase the consequences of the humans' decision. So God informs them that now every aspect of their life together, at home and out in the field, it's going to be fraught with grief and pain because of the rebellion, all leading to their death. From here, the story then spirals downward.
Human origins and Adam and Eve. The theological questions around the age of the earth or plant and animal evolution are one thing. But the theological questions around human origins are far more complex.
We're going to talk about Eve today. Is she the mother of all mankind?
According to the Bible, she should be, and according to a lot of evidence in science, she is also.
Adam and Eve as ancient ancestors. In this view, God specially created the first pair, Adam and Eve, but 150,000 years ago in Africa. Scientists have known for over a century that human anatomy is similar to chimpanzees and other apes. Evolution predicts that if humans share a common ancestor with these animals, there should be fossils going back in time that look less and less like modern humans or modern chimpanzees, and more like the common ancestor of both humans and chimps.
The Bible has God miraculously creating the world and everything in it in just 6 days about 6,000 years ago. But the theory of evolution has a much different timescale, taking millions of years to go from goo to me and you by way of the zoo. Which view is correct? Well, to be honest, both views require faith because no one was there thousands or millions of years ago to observe how it all got started. But can the idea of millions of years of evolution be scientifically validated? Can we really prove this idea of deep time using the same observational science we use for making medicine and putting people on the moon? Validation is the process of confirming what is believed to be true by what can be observed to be true. Has this ever been done for radiometric dating, the process that gives us the very idea of long ages? Actually, long ages and radiometric dating hasn't stood up to the validation test. Radiometric dating has never been validated against the absolute known ages of rocks. Let us explain. Consider Mount St. Helens. This volcano erupted in the 1980s, giving scientists the opportunity to date the rocks that were formed from the eruption. The results? 5 different ages, all between 350,000 and 2.8 million years old, for rocks that we know were less than 30 years old. This discrepancy happens all the time in radiometric dating studies. In fact, there has never been a radiometric dating analysis that simply produces ages that validate to the known ages of rocks. And if radiometric dating doesn't work for rocks of known ages, why do we trust it for rocks of unknown ages? So the next time you hear millions of years ago this happened or that, just ask, how do you know that for sure? And if radiometric dating is the answer given, just ask, are you aware of a study where the radiometric age of a rock agreed with the known age of the rock? And you'll find the answer will undoubtedly be no.
What is a gene? What is a piece of DNA? What is a genome? This is a picture of a person's genome.
Okay.
There's 3 billion letters amongst 46 molecules. Our molecules are called chromosomes. And they're broken up into these pieces, and the things that are written into those letters there control everything about us. This is the part of the genome that's inside the nucleus that's inside our cells.
So the first thing that we're going to do in this is we're really going to address the question, did humans and chimps share a common ancestor? So basically answering the question of who, right? Who did we all descend from? And so the first thing we do as Christians is we always go to God's word, right? What does God's word say? And it says that God created animals according to their kind, okay? And so we see that over and over again, talking about the birds and the beasts and the cattle and everything according to its kind. Obviously birds or swimming and flying creatures are on day 5, all the land animals on day 6. And so after he's done creating all of that, then he creates man, right? Man is clearly a separate creation from the animals, and he's different because he's made in God's image, right? We're not an animal, and so we are truly created separate, different individuals from the animals. So that's an important distinction. So clearly, from a biblical perspective, we did not evolve from some sort of common ancestor with the apes. So the question really comes down to the DNA. And one of the things that's really interesting is we have sequenced DNA for both humans and chimps. Okay, so we have that information. We can compare them. And so what do we find out when we compare the DNA? And Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins, who's a geneticist at the Institute for Creation Research, has done a lot of study on this. He's not only looked at what the evolutionists have done and how are they doing this, but he's done a lot of his own original research. And one of the things he found when he looked at what the evolutionists has done is that they have a lot of preferential and selective treatment of the data. Data is data. Depending on what you present and how you present it, you can make it say what you want it to say.
Yeah, and what you don't talk about, right? What you leave
right.
out.
Exactly, exactly. And so one of the things is they, a lot of times when they do these comparisons of the DNA, they just use sequences they expect to be similar, okay? So for example, they just use the genes. The genes are what give rise to the proteins. Now, I would expect the genes to be pretty similar because from a biological perspective, chimps are mammals, so are we. Okay, so our DNA should actually be, on that level, should be pretty similar. Our bodies have to do similar things. So it's not a good place to look for the differences, okay, if we're trying to evaluate what's different, because obviously we're very different from a chimp, so what makes us different? And even when they do count all of the DNA, let's say they look at everything, all the bases, there's certain differences they don't count. So they don't count what's called non-aligned DNA, gaps, copy number variations, and size differences. Now, you don't need to know what all of these things are. That's going to take more time than we have. But all of those things are legitimate differences between human and chimp DNA, but they're not counted.
Okay, and so they are part of the genetic code or whatever, the question here.
They're sequence differences, but they don't count them. Why? because they don't fit their evolutionary story. If you count all of these differences, there's way too many differences to account for in their evolutionary time frame.
And they don't want differences.
Fit.
Yeah.
And they're not going to change what they think about the past, so they have to make it fit. So how do they make it fit? Well, they only count one type of difference. And that's how they make it fit. And that's what we need to understand, is that when you see, you probably heard chimp and human DNA is 98 to 99% the same,
yes. I
right?
think we've all heard
so that's
that.
a 1 to 2% difference. Well, you need to realize they're only looking at one type. This is it.
They don't tell you that.
It's
Isn't that funny?
deceptive. And we're going to say this top line is human, and the bottom line is chimp here, okay? So when you compare the DNA, there will be areas that line up pretty good, that are pretty much, they're pretty similar. Now, there's still some differences, you can see that, but they're very similar. So the only difference that evolutionists count is differences in DNA, which are called substitutions in aligned regions. That's all they count. So for example, here you have a T, right, in a human, you have a G in the chimp. You have an A in the human, you have a G in the chimp. That's the only differences they count. Now, you can see just by looking at this, there's other differences.
Oh, yes.
Right? Here, we have chimp DNA, or human DNA, but no matching chimp.
So that would be a gap?
It's called a gap or an indel. Here's another one. Okay, so you have chimp but no human to match it. Then there's millions of bases outside of this, which is represented by this, that don't even line up at all. They're not aligned. So those are legitimate differences, but they're not counted into their evolutionary, because it doesn't fit their evolutionary story. They've even went so far sometimes as to say, oh, it's in part of the DNA that doesn't matter. This is all junk DNA out here, so it doesn't matter. And so that's a problem, because as we know through more studies, junk DNA really isn't junk. It's really important. All of it is important. There's none of it that isn't important. So you can't just say, oh, it's in part of the DNA that doesn't matter.
A third line of evidence is also genetic, the genetic diversity within the human population. Human DNA simply contains more variety than could arise from a single ancestral pair. The minimum bottleneck of the human population must have been thousands of individuals, not two.
Here's the world. This is what the Bible says.
Yep.
That at the Tower of Babel, God separated the nations according to language. He used language to separate them, and they spread out across the world. And that is exactly what modern genetics has discovered. A single dispersion of people across the face of the planet. So here's how we can explain this using the Bible. We have Eve. She's the mother of everybody. Eve has a mitochondrial genome. She passes it on to her children. Her children pass it on to her children. In the creation account we read in Genesis, there are 10 generations between Adam and Noah. Well, the Bible also describes 4 women being on board the ark, Noah's wife and his 3 daughters-in-law. So we can have about 10 generations from Eve to the 3 daughters-in-law. I don't know if M, N, and R are the 3 daughters-in-law, but it's highly, highly suspicious because there are 3 lines and they're found everywhere.
From an evolutionary perspective, this is kind of hard to understand. Because if 100,000 years ago there was 10,000 people, let's say half of them are women, okay? So let's say there's 5,000 that are women. That would be potentially 5,000 different lines, okay, of mitochondrial DNA. And we're only down to 1 today? I mean, how do you go from 5,000 to 1? I mean, the odds on that are pretty remote. But if you start with the biblical account, there was only 1 woman.
That makes sense.
So there should only be 1 today.
And people don't realize, but Eve is known. We know what Eve's sequence was. And here's why. If you take all the mitochondrial DNA in the world, it's only 16,000 letters. You can work with it on a laptop. It's a small file. You can line them up. And when you line them up, you realize, like, man, 85% of the letters out of those 16,000, everyone in the world has exactly the same letter. That means Eve had that letter.
Okay.
And if you look at the places where there's variability, it might be like everyone in the world has an A and one person has a T. Well, what did Eve have?
She had the
She
one.
had the A, more than likely.
Sure.
And if you apply that logic,
Probabilities are huge, yes.
you realize suddenly that Eve, almost all of Eve, is known easily.
We know the mutation rate of mitochondrial DNA. We know how fast it mutates. So if she's what the evolutionists say, 157,000 years old, we should see about 1,000 differences in the human population. If she's only 6,000 years old, not much time, we should only see about 20 to 79 differences in the human population. So we can look. There's mitochondrial DNA databases. It can look at all this. What did he find? 77 differences in humans. What does that confirm? Right? That she's young. Right? That mitochondrial DNA is young. Mitochondrial Eve has to be young.
God wrote with his own hand that he created the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them in just 6 ordinary days. The genealogies in Genesis lead us straight back to Adam, just about 6,000 years ago. Have you ever noticed how hard the world pushes the idea of millions of years? Books, movies, museums, schools, it's everywhere. But does any of this even matter? Well, consider this. Many people will only consider the Bible's message if they believe the Bible to be credible, both historically and scientifically. Each person's eternity, either in heaven or hell, depends on what they believe about the risen Christ. And how do we know about this? Well, it's in the Bible. And if people don't believe the Bible got it right on the first page, who's going to trust the rest? So, because it takes faith to believe in either the Bible or the world's view of this distant past, is it a better choice to trust God or a fallible man?